On the morning of the 17th of May 1944, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilot returning from a sortie over Kent photographed what appeared to be a critical weakness in British coastal defences. A newly constructed railway bridge spanning the River Medway, built with startling speed and seemingly inadequate reinforcement. German intelligence officers pored over the images, noting the bridge's load-bearing capacity, the apparent rail gauge, and most importantly, its precise location. They marked it on their maps as a priority target. 3 weeks later, on the night of the 8th of June, Luftwaffe bombers expended 17 tons of ordnance destroying it. The bridge collapsed spectacularly into the river, rails twisting, timber splintering. The Germans marked it as destroyed. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known from 20,000 feet, was that they just wasted precious bombs, fuel and pilot hours on a structure made entirely of scaffolding poles, canvas and painted wood. There had never been a real bridge there at all. This wasn't a lucky accident or a hastily improvised trick. This was the product of the most sophisticated deception infrastructure ever created, operated by units whose very existence remained classified until the 1970s. Whilst German engineers calculated load stresses and Italian intelligence measured bridge spans, British deception officers were exploiting a fundamental vulnerability in how modern militaries gathered information. The assumption that if something could be photographed, it must be real. The dummy bridge over the Medway was just one element in a network of false infrastructure. Fake bridges, dummy airfields, fabricated oil installations and phantom factories that systematically corrupted Axis targeting data across 3 theatres of war. By 1944, British deception units had constructed over 400 major false structures across England alone, employing more than 3,000 personnel in what was essentially an industrial-scale program of military forgery. The genius wasn't in fooling the enemy once. The genius was in understanding that Axis military planning operated on photographic intelligence, and then weaponizing that dependency against them. Every hour spent photographing, analyzing and bombing these fabrications was an hour not spent threatening actual strategic targets. Every ton of bombs dropped on canvas, and timber was a ton that didn't crater an actual runway or sever an actual supply line. The apparent vulnerability, constructing obvious exposed targets, was actually a form of offensive defense. Britain wasn't just protecting real assets, it was actively misdirecting enemy resources at industrial scale. Standard military doctrine in 1939 treated deception as a battlefield tactic, not a strategic program. Field commanders had used dummy positions since the Great War. False trenches, decoy guns, inflatable tanks positioned near actual units to confuse immediate tactical observations. But these were temporary measures, employed during specific operations and abandoned afterwards. The idea of maintaining permanent false infrastructure, of dedicating substantial resources to constructing and maintaining facilities that serve no actual military function, struck most planners as wasteful. General Hastings Ismay, Churchill's chief military assistant, initially opposed large-scale deception operations, arguing in an October 1940 memo that scarce construction resources must be devoted to genuine defensive works, not theatrical props. The German approach seemed to vindicate this conventional thinking. Luftwaffe intelligence operated on what they called the Schlüsselpunktprinzip, the key point principle. Their analysts identified critical infrastructure through systematic reconnaissance, bridges with specific load capacities, fuel depots with measurable storage volumes, airfields with particular runway configurations. Each target was assessed using objective criteria. A railway bridge needed specific dimensions to carry Mark IV tanks. A fuel storage facility required minimum tank volumes to justify the ordnance expenditure. An airfield needed runways of at least 800 meters to threaten German cities with heavy bombers. This methodical approach had proven devastatingly effective in Poland and France, where Luftwaffe targeting prioritization destroyed genuine bottlenecks and crippled enemy logistics before ground forces even engaged. Critics of British deception efforts argued that the Germans would simply see through obvious fakes. Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding noted in early 1941 that the Hun is methodical, not stupid. He photographs from multiple angles at different times of day and cross-references with human intelligence. A bridge that carries no traffic, an airfield with no tyre marks, a factory with no coal deliveries, these won't fool anyone for long. There was also the resource argument. The scaffolding, canvas, timber and paint used to construct dummy bridges could build real defensive positions. The engineers supervising construction of false targets could be strengthening actual bridges. The lorries transporting fake equipment could be moving genuine supplies. In a nation under siege, gambling scarce resources on what amounted to stage scenery seemed dangerously frivolous. The Japanese appeared to confirm these doubts. When Allied forces attempted similar deception operations in Burma in early 1942, Japanese intelligence quickly identified false positions through ground reconnaissance and local intelligence networks. A dummy airfield constructed near Magui was ignored entirely after Japanese scouts observed the lack of fuel bowsers, support vehicles, or defensive positions. The Japanese command concluded that if a target was obviously fake from the ground, aerial photography would eventually reveal the truth. What use was a deception that only worked until the enemy took a second look? What made British dummy infrastructure work wasn't crude fakery. It was meticulous engineering designed specifically to defeat photographic analysis. The key innovation came from Colonel John Turner, a civil engineer who'd spent 15 years designing bridges in India before the war. Turner understood that German photo interpreters weren't looking at bridges, they were looking at photographs of bridges. The question wasn't, does this look real in person, but rather, does this produce the correct photographic signature when viewed from 15,000 feet through reconnaissance camera optics? Turner's first test dummy, constructed across the River Ouse near York in December 1940, demonstrated the principle. Using scaffolding poles as primary supports, engineers created a bridge span 83 meters long, exactly matching the dimensions needed to carry standard rolling stock across that particular river width. But the crucial details were in the photographic deception. The roadbed was canvas stretched over lightweight frames, painted to show realistic weathering, oil stains, and even carefully placed wear patterns suggesting heavy traffic. Shadows were engineered. Vertical posts were positioned to cast convincing shadows at the angles German reconnaissance typically photographed from, 62 to 75 degrees from vertical, based on analysis of captured Luftwaffe camera angles. The bridge approaches included false embankments built from timber frames covered in painted hessian, complete with simulated drainage works and approach roads that showed appropriate wheel ruts. The materials tell the story. Each major dummy bridge required approximately 120 scaffolding poles, requisitioned from bombed-out buildings, 300 meters of canvas, sourced from theatrical suppliers and redundant military tents, 40 liters of paint, mixed to match actual bridge colors under varying light conditions, and specialized camouflage netting to simulate weathering. Construction took a trained crew of 16 men approximately 6 days, compared to the 6 weeks and 200 workers needed for an actual military bridge of comparable span. The cost differential was even more striking. £1,850 for a dummy bridge that would take months to be exposed versus £47,000 for a real structure that could be destroyed in minutes. But the technical sophistication went beyond the structures themselves. British deception units created entire false operational signatures. Dummy bridges were photographed deliberately, with Royal Air Force reconnaissance aircraft flying obvious patterns over them to ensure German intelligence intercepted the images. Traffic was simulated. Lorries were driven across at specific intervals during daylight hours when Luftwaffe reconnaissance was most likely. Maintenance crews were stationed nearby, visible during the day, reinforcing the impression of an active, defended structure. Near some dummy bridges, engineers even created false bomb damage, complete with cratered approach roads and repaired sections, to suggest the structure was valuable enough that previous attacks had occurred. The secret was in understanding the enemy's intelligence cycle. German photo interpreters worked from standardised assessment criteria. A bridge photograph was analysed for structural shadow patterns, indicating load-bearing capacity, approach infrastructure, suggesting usage volume, defensive emplacements, indicating military value, and environmental integration, weathering, vegetation patterns, maintenance evidence. Each criterion could be engineered. Shadow patterns were created with careful positioning of vertical elements. Approach infrastructure was built just inside the resolution limits of German cameras, detailed enough to register, too small to reveal its falsity. Defensive positions were actual sandbagged emplacements, cheaper than fake ones, manned by training units who benefited from the realistic fortification practice. Environmental integration came from theatrical scene painters recruited specifically for their weathering techniques. What made this work wasn't any single feature, but rather the systematic exploitation of how photographic intelligence was processed. German analysts assessed hundreds of photographs daily. They couldn't visit each site personally or spend hours analysing every detail. They looked for specific signatures, and if those signatures appeared correct, the target was catalogued and prioritised accordingly. British engineers weren't fooling human perception. They were passing an intelligence checklist. The Medway Bridge bombing of June 1944 wasn't an isolated incident. Between January 1941 and May 1945, Luftwaffe and Italian air forces conducted 246 documented raids against dummy targets in Britain, expending an estimated 4,680 tons of bombs on non-existent infrastructure. But the most revealing case study comes from Operation Fortitude South, the deception operation supporting D-Day, where dummy infrastructure became the centerpiece of the entire strategic deception. In March 1944, engineers from the Royal Engineers 5th Camouflage Unit constructed what appeared to be a critical new Thames crossing near Gravesend. The bridge spanned 104 metres, with approaches suggesting it could handle sustained heavy lorry traffic, precisely the type of infrastructure needed to support an invasion force assembling in Kent. German reconnaissance photographed it on the 3rd of April 1944. Intelligence assessments noted its strategic importance. It connected previously isolated road networks and could facilitate rapid armour movement toward channel ports. On 15th April, it was added to priority target lists. 3 separate bombing raids were conducted against it between 22nd April and 8th May, with a total of 34 tons of bombs dropped. Post-strike reconnaissance showed the bridge destroyed, rail approaches cratered, and nearby supply dumps, also fake, damaged. The operational impact can be measured precisely. Each bombing raid against the Gravesend dummy bridge required an average of 18 aircraft, Junkers Ju-88s and Heinkel He-100s and 11s, consumed approximately 47,000 litres of aviation fuel, exposed crews to anti-aircraft fire, and occupied bomber capacity for 6 to 8 hours, including preparation, flight time and return. Intelligence analysis of each strike consumed approximately 40 man-hours of photo interpreter time. Repair assessments, watching to see if the British rebuilt it, consumed additional surveillance resources. The 3 raids together represented roughly 540 aircraft hours and 120 analyst hours devoted to a target that existed only in photographs and German planning maps. But the strategic deception went deeper. Captured German planning documents from 15th Army, responsible for Pas-de-Calais defences, show that they factored the Gravesend Bridge into their assessment of where the invasion would land. Staff maps marked it as a critical logistics node, suggesting British preparations in Kent, exactly where the Allies wanted Germans to expect the landings, 200 miles from the actual Normandy beaches. A March 1945 interrogation of Oberst Friedrich Hein, former intelligence officer with Army Group B, revealed that German planners had catalogued 73 new or upgraded bridges in southeast England between January and May 1944. Of these, 41 were entirely fictitious. "We believed the British were preparing to support an army of 60 divisions in Kent and Sussex," Haynes stated. "Our defensive positions were based substantially on infrastructure assessments, including bridges, that we now know were theatrical constructions. The mathematics of deception become clear when examining the aggregate. The 246 raids against dummy targets represented approximately 4,428 aircraft sorties. If each sortie had instead targeted genuine military infrastructure, radar stations, actual airfields, genuine fuel depots, real bridges, the operational impact would have been devastating. Fighter Command estimated in a post-war analysis that if the 4,680 tons of bombs dropped on dummy targets between 1941 and 1945 had instead hit actual sector airfields, it would have resulted in an estimated 840 additional aircraft destroyed on the ground, 32 radar installations knocked offline for extended periods, and approximately 190 days of accumulated runway closure across critical bases. Perhaps most tellingly, the Germans never stopped bombing dummy targets. Even in late 1944, with fuel desperately short and bomber losses mounting, Luftwaffe raids continued against false infrastructure because their intelligence apparatus had no reliable way to distinguish real from false in photographs. A dummy oil storage facility at Shoeburyness was bombed 4 separate times between September 1944 and February 1945, each time being destroyed and then rebuilt. British engineers would repair the canvas and timber structures within days. German intelligence noted the rapid repairs as evidence of the facility's importance, never questioning whether something that could be rebuilt so quickly might not be real at all. The success of dummy bridges and false infrastructure wasn't about fooling German eyeballs, it was about corrupting German planning processes. This wasn't accidental. Lieutenant Colonel Dudley Clark, who established British deception doctrine in 1940, understood a crucial principle. Modern militaries didn't operate on ground truth. They operated on intelligence assessments of ground truth. "We don't need to fool their pilots or photo interpreters indefinitely," Clark wrote in a December 1940 memo. "We only need to introduce sufficient uncertainty that their planning must account for possibilities rather than certainties. A German commander who must consider that a bridge might be real must allocate resources as if it is real, or accept the risk that it destroys him." This philosophy inverted traditional military thinking. Conventional doctrine held that intelligence served planning. You gathered information to make better decisions. Clark recognized that in modern warfare, intelligence had become planning. German operational planning was built on intelligence-derived target lists, load-bearing calculations, and infrastructure assessments. If you could manipulate those foundational assumptions, you corrupted every subsequent planning decision. A staff officer planning an air campaign against southern England didn't personally inspect bridges. He worked from targeting folders that listed bridge coordinates, spans, and load capacities. If those folders contained fabricated data, his entire planning architecture was compromised. The difference between British and German approaches came down to how they validated intelligence. German military doctrine, inherited from the Prussian tradition, prized systematic methodology. Intelligence was gathered through structured reconnaissance, processed through standardised analysis procedures, and delivered as objective assessments. This produced excellent results when the enemy fought conventionally, when a bridge photographed was a bridge built for actual use. But it created a systematic vulnerability. The methodology couldn't adapt to an enemy deliberately exploiting the methodology itself. British deception officers, by contrast, worked from adversarial assumptions. They asked not what is true, but what will the enemy think is true, and then engineered evidence to support useful falsehoods. The dummy bridges weren't designed to look real to someone standing beside them. They were designed to produce intelligence reports that would enter German planning systems as real data. Every detail was built to defeat the specific intelligence verification methods Germans employed. No traffic at night. That's when most traffic occurred anyway to avoid daytime raids. Quick repairs after bombing. That proves the bridge's strategic importance. Minimal defensive positions. The British are concentrating defences around actual military facilities, treating this bridge as civilian infrastructure. What made this particularly effective was the resource asymmetry. Britain spent approximately £740,000 across 4 years maintaining the dummy bridge and false airfield programme in southern England, roughly 0.002% of total war expenditure. Germany spent vastly more in fuel, ordnance, aircraft maintenance, and human resources attacking these targets, to say nothing of the opportunity cost of not hitting real infrastructure. A Luftwaffe bombing raid that destroyed a dummy bridge cost Germany perhaps £18,000 in operational expenses, fuel, ammunition, wear on aircraft, crew time, plus the irreplaceable cost of exposing crews to anti-aircraft fire. The exchange ratio was almost comically one-sided. Britain spent pounds to cost Germany thousands. But perhaps the most important factor was psychological. German intelligence officers were being rational. They correctly identified that bridges were strategic bottlenecks, that destroying them hindered enemy logistics, and that photographic reconnaissance could locate them. Every assumption in that chain was correct. What they couldn't account for, what their methodology had no mechanism to detect, was an enemy deliberately creating false infrastructure specifically to exploit those correct assumptions. In interrogations after the war, captured German intelligence officers consistently expressed not just surprise, but a kind of professional betrayal. How can intelligence function if the enemy deliberately constructs falsehoods? Asked one analyst. The question revealed the fundamental assumption. Intelligence existed to discover truth, not to navigate a landscape where the enemy actively engineered false evidence. That was precisely the point. Battlefields aren't neutral information environments. They're contested spaces where adversaries fight not just with guns, but with information. The side that understands this, that actively shapes what the enemy knows and believes, doesn't just gain tactical advantages, it fundamentally changes the strategic calculus, forcing the enemy to operate in a fog of engineered uncertainty, where even objective evidence cannot be trusted. Whilst the British dummy bridge programme is most documented in England, the technique expanded dramatically in the Mediterranean theatre after 1942, where it achieved perhaps its most operationally significant results. The North African campaign presented unique opportunities, vast spaces, limited German reconnaissance assets, and supply lines where every bridge, port and fuel depot genuinely mattered. In January 1943, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Sicily, deception units constructed an elaborate false logistics network along the Egyptian coast. The centrepiece was a dummy bridge across a wadi near El Alamein, complete with what appeared to be a new coastal road extending westward. German reconnaissance photographed it repeatedly between February and April 1943. Intelligence assessments concluded the Allies were preparing a substantial logistics route, possibly for renewed offensive operations into Libya. 3 bombing raids were conducted against the bridge and associated supply dumps in March 1943. What made this particularly effective was the context. German and Italian forces were desperately trying to assess Allied intentions. Would the next offensive target Sardinia, Sicily, mainland Italy, or the Balkans? Every piece of infrastructure evidence helped narrow the possibilities. A major new logistics route in Egypt suggested renewed North African operations, drawing attention away from Sicily. Post-war analysis of German Mediterranean Command documents shows the false Egyptian infrastructure directly influenced defensive deployments, with 2 divisions retained in Libya longer than operationally necessary, because commanders anticipated Allied operations the infrastructure seemed to support. The technique evolved further during the Italian campaign. As Allied forces advanced up the peninsula in 1944, engineers constructed dummy bridges across rivers in rear areas, deliberately visible to German reconnaissance. These served multiple purposes. They suggested Allied logistic routes that didn't exist, drew German air attacks away from actual river crossings, and created targeting dilemmas. When German commanders identified 6 apparent river crossings, where Allied doctrine suggested 3 would be sufficient, they had to either spread defensive resources across all 6 or gamble on which were real. Meanwhile, actual Allied crossings occurred at entirely different locations, exploiting the confusion. The most sophisticated iteration appeared during the Rhine crossing preparations in early 1945. British engineers constructed dummy bridge structures at 4 locations along the Rhine between January and March, each carefully positioned to appear as preparation for assault crossings. German defensive planning had to account for multiple possible crossing points, spreading artillery, reserves, and observation assets across a wider frontage. The actual crossings at Remagen, Wessel, and other locations achieved tactical surprise, partly because German attention was geometrically distributed across both real and false possibilities. What distinguishes the British dummy infrastructure program from traditional military deception was its industrial organisation. This wasn't improvised battlefield trickery, it was systematised production. By 1943, British deception operations employed 3 dedicated camouflage units, 5th, 7th and 11th Camouflage Units, Royal Engineers, multiple contracted civilian firms, and a centralised design bureau that standardised dummy construction techniques. The bureaucracy reveals the scale. Requisitions for dummy bridge materials went through formal procurement channels. Engineers submitted construction plans showing precise specifications, scaffold dimensions, canvas grades, paint formulations. Quality control inspectors visited sites to ensure dummies would photograph correctly. Maintenance schedules dictated when weathering needed refreshing or damage effects updated. This wasn't theatrical improvisation, it was manufacturing to specification. The logistics were substantial. Maintaining the 400-plus major dummy structures across Britain required approximately 1,200 tons of scaffolding, constantly recycled between structures, 180,000 square meters of canvas, replaced every 8 to 12 months due to weather degradation, 340,000 litres of paint over 4 years, and 2,400 kilometres of camouflage netting. Transportation consumed 840 lorry loads annually, moving materials between storage depots and construction sites. Storage facilities in requisitioned warehouses held prefabricated components, standardised bridge sections, pre-painted canvas panels, modular framework elements, allowing rapid deployment. Personnel numbers tell their own story. The 3 Royal Engineer camouflage units totaled approximately 1,100 personnel directly involved in construction and maintenance. Supporting roles, procurement, design, transportation, site security, engaged another 1,900 personnel across various commands. Theatrical professionals were directly recruited, scene painters from London's West End theatres, film set designers from Pinewood and Ealing Studios, even magicians whose understanding of misdirection and perception informed design choices. The painter Basil Spence, later famous as an architect, spent 2 years painting weathering effects on dummy structures. The theatrical designer Oliver Messel created entire false factory facades. Training became systematized. Engineers attended a 3-week course at the Camouflage Development and Training Centre in Farnham, where they learned photographic analysis, shadow engineering, and material weathering techniques. The curriculum included lectures on enemy intelligence methods, practical exercises in rapid construction, and remarkably sessions where German reconnaissance photographs were analysed to understand exactly what signatures enemy interpreters looked for. Trainees were tested not on whether their work looked real to human eyes, but whether it photographed correctly from reconnaissance altitudes. The command structure reveals institutional commitment. Deception operations reported through the London Controlling Section, which coordinated directly with the Chiefs of Staff. This wasn't a peripheral activity managed by field commanders. It was strategic-level operations directed from Churchill's War Cabinet. Weekly reports detailed dummy structures maintained, enemy reconnaissance sorties observed, and bombing raids attracted. Success metrics were tracked, ordnance tonnage expended on false targets, aircraft sorties diverted, intelligence assessments corrupted. Perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of the dummy infrastructure program wasn't the construction. It was the counterintelligence operations that validated and reinforced the deceptions. British intelligence didn't just build false bridges and hope Germans noticed them. They actively monitored whether Germans were noticing, how they were assessing them, and what planning decisions resulted. This operated through multiple channels. Ultra-decrypts of German communications provided direct insight into whether false targets were being catalogued and prioritized. When ultra-intercepts showed Luftwaffe commands planning raids against specific dummy installations, British controllers knew the deception was succeeding. More remarkably, they could then calibrate the deception. If a dummy target wasn't drawing attention, engineers might add more visible detail or stage apparent activity to make it more noticeable. If a target was being ignored after initial photography, that suggested Germans had identified it as false, triggering analysis of what gave it away. The double-cross system, Britain's network of turned German agents, provided another validation mechanism. Agents reporting back to Germany were fed information about genuine infrastructure, but also about dummy installations described as if real. When German intelligence acted on agent reports about false structures, photographing them more extensively, planning raids, British controllers knew the deception was being accepted. Agent reports were carefully calibrated. Too much detail would seem suspicious, too little would be dismissed. The art was in providing just enough corroboration to make photographic intelligence seem validated by human sources. Perhaps most cleverly, British deception officers monitored German bombing patterns to assess target prioritization. When raids occurred against dummy installations, post-strike reconnaissance from British aircraft was deliberately conducted and sometimes allowed to be observed by remaining German reconnaissance. This served dual purposes. It showed the British assessing damage, suggesting the target was real, and it allowed Germans to photograph destruction, confirming their strike success. Engineers would then conduct visible repairs over subsequent weeks, creating the impression that important infrastructure was being restored, further validating German assessments that the target mattered. The feedback loop was continuous. Photographic reconnaissance showed what Germans photographed. Ultra showed what they concluded. Agent networks showed what independent confirmation they sought. Bombing patterns showed what they prioritized. Each data stream informed adjustments to dummy installations, creating an adaptive deception that evolved in response to enemy intelligence methods. When German photo interpreters began examining shadows more carefully in late 1942, British engineers refined shadow engineering techniques. When Germans started correlating multiple photographs taken at different times to detect static traffic, British crews varied dummy vehicle positioning and staging. The objections to dummy infrastructure programs, that they wasted resources, that sophisticated intelligence would see through them, that they diverted efforts from genuine defensive work, all rested on a fundamental miscalculation. Critics assessed costs and benefits as if deception were competing with other defensive measures for the same strategic outcome. The reality was that deception achieved outcomes no amount of conventional defense could match. It made the enemy actively weaken himself. Consider the arithmetic. Britain spent roughly £740,000 on dummy bridges and associated false infrastructure over 4 years. That budget built structures that drew 4,680 tons of German bombs. Setting aside the operational costs to Germany, fuel, aircraft wear, crew time, consider just the ordnance. German bombs averaged £147 per ton manufacturing cost. So 4,680 tons represented £688,000 in enemy ordnance alone, nearly recovering the entire program cost before accounting for operational expenses, opportunity costs, or strategic misdirection. but this severely understates the return. Every ton of bombs dropped on false targets was a ton not dropped on fighter command airfields, radar stations, aircraft factories, genuine bridges, or ports. The strategic value of preventing damage to real infrastructure dwarfed the cost of providing false targets. Fighter Command estimated post-war that if just 20% of the ordnance wasted on dummy targets had instead hit actual sector airfields at optimal timing during 1940 to 1941, it might have achieved the runway denial and aircraft destruction that the historical Battle of Britain failed to accomplish. The resource comparison critics made was also misleading. Yes, the scaffolding, canvas and paint used for dummies could have built defensive positions, but defensive positions are static assets that provide local protection. Dummy installations were offensive weapons that actively degraded enemy capability. A pillbox protects the soldiers inside it. A dummy bridge that draws a bombing raid protects every genuine installation that raid might otherwise have targeted, while simultaneously depleting enemy resources. The strategic multiplier effect was entirely different. Furthermore, the resources for dummy construction often couldn't be reallocated to conventional defense anyway. The scaffolding came from bombed buildings, material that would otherwise have been cleared as rubble. The canvas came from theatrical suppliers whose peacetime market had vanished. Production capacity that would otherwise have sat idle. The paint was often overstock or non-specification batches, unsuitable for critical applications. The labour was engineers learning construction techniques, theatrical workers whose skills had no conventional military application, and soldiers in training units who benefited from the practical fortification experience. The opportunity cost wasn't nearly as high as critics assumed. Most fundamentally, critics failed to account for the strategic asymmetry. Germany had finite bombing capacity, finite reconnaissance assets, finite intelligence analysis capability. Every raid against a false target wasn't just wasted. It was a raid that couldn't occur against a real target. In a war of attrition, where both sides competed to destroy enemy capabilities faster than they could be regenerated, any program that accelerated enemy resource depletion whilst preserving friendly capabilities was strategically sound almost regardless of cost. The principle proved itself repeatedly. After the war, Allied intelligence analysed German logistics and operational planning documents across all theatres. The analysis found that German planning consistently factored false infrastructure into operational calculations, defensive deployments, and targeting prioritisation. False bridges influenced where they thought Allied logistics could support offensives. Dummy airfields influenced where they positioned anti-aircraft assets. Fake fuel depots influenced where they expected to find bombing targets. Each false data point contaminated multiple layers of planning, creating compounding errors that diverged German preparations from reality. The British dummy infrastructure program fundamentally changed how militaries understood the relationship between intelligence and operations. Prior to World War II, deception was tactical and temporary. A commander might mislead about unit positions before a specific battle, then return to normal operations. The British approach demonstrated that deception could be strategic, continuous, and industrial. A permanent program that systematically corrupted enemy intelligence as an offensive weapon. This required a conceptual shift. Traditional military thinking treated information as a neutral resource to be gathered and protected. Intelligence officers sought truth. Operations officers exploited truth. Security officers protected truth. The British dummy program showed that information itself could be weaponized, that deliberately engineering false but plausible information, ensuring it reached the enemy, and then exploiting the enemy's predictable response to the false information could achieve strategic effects comparable to kinetic operations. The methodology spread rapidly after 1943. American forces adopted similar techniques in the Pacific, constructing dummy installations to draw Japanese air attacks. Soviet forces used maskirovka, military deception, extensively on the Eastern Front. Those Soviet programs emphasized concealing real capabilities, whilst British programs emphasized creating false ones. By 1944, all major Allied forces had dedicated deception units applying variations of British techniques. Post-war doctrine absorbed these lessons systematically. NATO planning incorporated deception as a standard element of defensive operations. Military engineering manuals included specifications for dummy installations. Intelligence training taught how to engineer photographic evidence and how to detect false signatures. The Cold War saw extensive programs of false infrastructure, dummy missile sites, fake radar installations, fabricated storage facilities designed to complicate Soviet targeting and assessment. The principle extended beyond physical infrastructure. Electronic warfare emerged as a direct descendant. If you could create false physical infrastructure to corrupt enemy intelligence, you could create false electronic signatures to corrupt enemy sensors. Radar decoys, communications deception, electronic jamming, all applied the same concept of actively feeding the enemy information designed to provoke resource-wasting responses. Modern doctrine calls it information warfare, but the core principle remains identical to what British engineers practiced in 1940 to 1945. Understand how the enemy gathers and processes information, identify what signatures he looks for, engineer those signatures in contexts that serve your purposes, and then exploit his predictable response. The dummy bridge that drew Luftwaffe raids in 1944 and the spoofed radar signature that draws a modern missile toward a false target are implementations of the same operational concept. Perhaps the deepest legacy is psychological. The dummy infrastructure program taught military planners an uncomfortable truth. You cannot trust your intelligence simply because it comes from objective sensors and systematic analysis. Photographs don't lie, but they can show things built specifically to be photographed. Signals intercepts don't lie, but they can capture communication staged for interception. Documents don't lie, but they can be genuine documents containing deliberately false information. Modern intelligence operates with awareness that it exists in a contested space where adversaries actively work to manipulate what sensors detect and analysts conclude. The dummy bridge, canvas stretched over scaffolding, painted to photograph correctly, maintained at industrial scale, and defended just enough to seem valuable, was never about fooling German eyes. It was about exploiting German planning processes, depleting German resources, and protecting British capabilities by providing false targets that drew fire away from real ones. That a structure that never carried a single vehicle or supported a single ton of cargo could materially influence strategic outcomes showed something profound. In modern warfare, what the enemy thinks is often more important than what actually is. The side that understands this doesn't just defend better, it turns enemy intelligence itself into a vulnerability to be exploited. The Luftwaffe bombs that destroyed canvas bridges and timber airfields didn't fail because German pilots missed their targets. They failed because Britain had created targets designed to be destroyed. And in destroying them, German forces accomplished precisely what British planners intended. That's not defence. That's operational art at strategic scale.